Understanding market cycles is kind of critical because people tell me right now it's a buyer's market. But you know the great thing about a buyer's market? Most of those buyers are also sellers. So it's also a buyer's market for the seller who's selling. Now this is an interesting thing because as markets shift, agents need to learn to adapt boldly to those conditions of the day. And what we're finding is a really simple thing. Anyone, for example, that has bought in maybe the course of the last 8 months, they're actually in a position today that if they went to sell, they have probably overpaid compared to what the market would repay because any growth that happened in that 8-month cycle has probably come off. Now, the interesting conversation about that is that if they have already bought at the high level and now they need to sell, that particular group of people is seriously affected by the difference in the changeover costs. But if, for example, you sell first and then you're buying into the current market, then you're selling in the same market that you're buying, and so there actually is no difference. And technically, if property prices have come back in your area by 5-10%, it's actually 5 or 10% cheaper to actually do the transaction today than it was, say, 8 months ago. Now, one of the things to think about is that buyers get quite conservative because anyone who's buying today probably won't be able to sell and to recoup their stamp duty and agents' costs for maybe 2 or 3 years. Because in terms of the current market cycle, you pretty much saw 60 months of growth that has then been followed by 2, 3, 4 months of maybe a little bit of softening inside of a market. Now, if you go through 60 months of growth and then you get 2 or 3 months worth of softening, well, really, we should be thinking that anyone who bought a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago has actually made a ton of cash on the way through. The problem is if they had you out to come and do a market appraisal, say in November, and you were telling them, say, 1.1 million, and now they come today and you're going through that listing presentation and today you're really thinking maybe $1 million, that's a bitter pill to swallow because you think that you've lost 100,000. But the thing is that the house that you wanted to buy was 1.5, it's now more likely 1.35 or 1.4, and it's actually also had the same trim that you've had on yours, the actual transactional costs are less. So what an agent really needs to do is to understand the motivation of the consumer. And so I just ask buyers this very simple question, hey, quick question, why are you looking to buy now? Because I want to assess the level of motivation to actually make sure that they understand it. Because given the new regulatory framework around finances, what we're actually seeing now is it might take 4, 6, 8 weeks to actually get finance approval. Now, the reason why that is such an important thing to understand is that if that's what's happening for the consumer today, then we need to help them to be able to make even better decisions. So what I would say to you is this. What a great agent really does is that they are getting buyers now to go and get their finance pre-approved and explaining that whole conversation about the timeline for why finance is occurring that way. This was the first time, particularly in the Australian market, that we'd ever seen property prices come back. It wasn't triggered by an interest rate increase. And what it actually was triggered by was APRA and their conversation with the banks about the requirement for how much revenue they needed to have sitting inside of their business before they could lend out any more funds. And so they said to banks, for example, like the Commonwealth Bank, you need another $1 billion in cash sitting inside of your safety deposit boxes before you're allowed to lend any more cash out. And so that really changed the environment because they changed something called the LVR, the loan to value ratio, which was then requiring, for example, that people needed to have a minimum of a 20% deposit. And what we saw in New Zealand is that some of those LVRs had changed to a 40 or 60% deposit requirement for people to actually make a deposit on a property before they could go and get the loan for the balance. Now what that did is it just completely slowed up investors. And that's ultimately what the government is doing, is that they're using new frameworks to actually restrict about the demand and supply in any market to ensure that property prices don't continue to grow well above wage growth. So that's the new market you're in. But at the end of the day, births, deaths, marriages, divorces, job relocations, all of those things still happen. And so it's really important that you as an agent get close to understanding what the motivation is of the client today and what you can do to really push them through. So this is about learning to adapt boldly to the conditions of the day and to get yourself back on the front foot to really building a great business. I really hope that you've enjoyed today's coaching tip, and I look forward to seeing you next week.